Yeah, welcome. Like Leah said, our presentation today is about what the Japanese called the Great Pacific Conflict. And also I'm going to go into the background of the Japanese, the history leading up to the war, and the North Dakota 164th National Guard and who we were. And the 164th and the Japanese went head to head in the first land battle of World War II. Unless you don't count the Philippines, but that was not an aggressive battle. Of course, that was retreating of what we have. This is a modern map of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean covers almost a quarter of the geographical area of the world. Up here were the Aleutian Islands connected to Alaska, Japan. Up here, Russia. This was the Siberia, China, and Mongolia up here. Korea, Japan, and what many people are here familiar with now, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were that called the I forgot the name.
We'll get to it.
Indochina. Yeah, Indochina. And Indonesia down here, which then was called the Dutch Indies. New Guinea, the north part was controlled by the Dutch. Big, insurmountable ridge of mountains in between. Southern New Guinea was the British New Guinea, and over here are the Solomon Islands. On the Solomon Islands was a pretty much unknown little island. It's not on the map, it's too small, called Guadalcanal, and nobody had ever heard. But this is going to be a very important focal point for the conflict between the U.S. and the Japanese in World War II. First I'm going to go through kind of a history of the Japanese, get us up to speed here. The Japanese didn't understand us, we didn't understand them, and pretty much we really didn't care, which we should have paid probably more attention to. But the Japanese had been shaped by a long history in a closed society. That Japan was pretty much a bunch of tribes in the early days, with a tribal chief in charge of each area. In 660 AD, Emperor Jimo, who was probably a tribal chief, he treated the policy of Hako Ichiu, which meant Japan controlling all 8 corners of the world, that Jimohu, and would be ruled by the Japanese emperor. So there was, of course, a limited amount of the world that he was aware of, but the feeling was that someday Japan would rule the whole rural that he knew of. Yes, 1192 AD, the Shogun warriors captured the emperor. And the emperor may not have been of all Japan at the time, but the Shogun declared the emperor to be so holy that it would be insulting to ask him to stoop to govern. Okay? So this is the origin of emperor worship that lasted into the 1940s. The Shogun ruled by force, and their warriors were called the samurai. Samurai laws were strict. The samurai were free to enforce as they pleased. We were arrogant, and people were forced to bow to. The samurai sword was the weapon of enforcement, and you could lose your head at the whim of the samurai. The Spanish and Portuguese arrived first in the area in the 16th century, and Europeans discovered Japan in the 17th century. Japanese considered all Europeans to be the same and considered them weak because they were always fighting with each other. But the Japanese found the Europeans useful, the trade useful, so foreigners were allowed in the port of Nagasaki only, and an island off of Nagasaki. That's where all the trade was done. But they were not allowed anywhere else in Japan. It was against the law. An American vessel arrived in the area in the 1820s, a whaling vessel, which wrecked and was washed ashore. This was against the law. The sailors were mistreated by the samurai, and some were killed for no reason that the Americans could understand. Yeah, for now. The Japanese understood and the fact that they were abused and even beheaded, killed, made the perfect sense to the Japanese people. They violated the samurai code. In the 1850s, the Americans came to Japan for a trade agreement. A Japanese insulted the American negotiator, and he did not respond appropriately, which may have meant even shooting the guy. But the Japanese, because of this, considered the Americans weak and refused to negotiate with it. And then the Americans returned later with a warship, and the Japanese, of course, had no defense for this. Their defense were the samurai with the sword. If we had gone ashore, they would ret the samurai. But we had this big ship, naval ship, and he was backed up by a couple others, and he said there are more waiting if we need them. He made that up. Anyway, the Japanese negotiated for months and months and realized that they needed to negotiate trade with the United States. The Japanese were still looking at the fact that the time would come that the Japanese emperor would rule possibly all nations. And so they needed the trade to build up their nation. In 1855, the Dutch sold a warship to Japan and trained them how to use it. The Japanese sailed it to the United States and were pretty much astonished that what they found there, how far advanced and modern in the United States was. We had railroads, we had telegraph, we had all kinds of things that, and the manufacture, just the fact that the things that they were producing, you had a chance to look at all this stuff. So they were, of course, very interested in all of this. In 1868, a 15-year-old emperor, Meiji, was succeeded to the throne. It says, all clans united behind the emperor, so now Japan was united, and the emperor announced that all power would be restored to the throne, in other words, him. The emperor immediately moved to modernize Japan. He set up a government that lasted through World War II, including a civilian House of Representatives. He wanted a part of the government to be ruled not by the military, not by him, but by elected, well, actually, like Asupatide, elected by male property owners, which is democratic, as about anybody got. Japan leapt into the Industrial Revolution at this time, and a third of all taxes went to the military. In 1895, Japan took over Korea. Man, push a button there. 1895, they took over Korea, and China and Russia were in the process of each trying to play it. Korea actually surprised and finished off a Russia Beatty to take Russia out of the picture, and they took possession of Korea in 1895. And 1895 was also the year of the Spanish-American War, and this is where the United States showed up in the Philippines. A presentation a couple years ago, this was talked about here, and so now the Americans were the new colonialists, and at the same time, 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii. So now Hawaii, this was the first out of the continent colony that the United States had. We are now colonialists and Japanist. So now U.S. is now the new imperial power, and Japanese relations with the U.S. Started to deteriorate. The next thing Japanese did right away was come down here and grab the island of Formosa, which today is called Taiwan. So they were beginning to spread their own empire, or create it. The U.S. kind of viewed the areas here and for colonial expansion as what they called waste spaces, and they were inhabited by people who needed to be modernized, whatever. In other words, United States was racist and treated people as inferior people. And of course, Japan thought the opposite, because they were thinking about the domination that was part of their mentality at the time. And later even some Paris peace talks in the 30s, or even the 20s actually, it was proposed, Japan proposed a resolution that all people would be equal. And the United States said no. But Japan is looking for at least that much. And also Japan felt they had the same right to colonize everything as the Europeans and the United States. So they felt they had as much right to any of these European colonies as the Europeans did. So, with modernization of Japan, the samurai at this point were out, and Emperor Meiji at this point died and left Emperor Taisho. He was next appointed as emperor. He was very weak. A lot of people, as much as they dared to, considered him mentally unbalanced, and he was basically incapable of being emperor. So his advisors were basically ruling, and what this did, it gave the army an opening to assert themselves. And a lot of the civilian government, the Japanese were ruled by a prime minister, and prime ministers kept getting, assassinated. So somebody also have to be appointed prime minister. And the list kept getting shorter. And also, Japan really did want all the Europeans out of Asia. Besides the whole idea of taking over the colonies. And 1926. Then Hirohito finally became emperor, and he was the emperor through World War II and beyond. But the Japanese at the same time were very careful about what the rest of the world thought of them, because they wanted to be, like I said, at least considered equal, if not superior, to the rest of the world. So they were very conscious of as to how they were received. All young men in Japan were required to have 2 years of military training. The training was harsh, brutal, and they began each day by reciting the phrase, "Whether I float as a corpse under the water or sink beneath the grasses of the mountainside, I willingly die for the emperor," every morning. And it was like the learning of modern fighting methods were kind of secondary to the harsh getting ready to their version of training. To surrender or retreat not only dishonored the soldier, but also his family. The consequences for the family could be pretty dire. So, and also in Japan, all soldiers were basically considered the same as far as, there was different rank, but there was really, like, in a way, no medals or heroes or individual praise, really, because the expectations were the same for everybody. And These, most of the enlisted people in Japan were, again, young men who came from a farm background, or peasants. And in the 1930s, this was during the Depression. Depression hit the Japanese as well as the rest of the world, and it actually hurt their trade because silks, that's something that the farm wife, for instance, or peasant's wife could produce and sell across the world, especially the United States. But with the Depression in the United States, also that market died, so this hurt the poor people in Japan, the farmers, peasants. Meanwhile, back in North Dakota, this is a map of, I think, 1929 of North Dakota. Pretty much no pavement at all. You can see little bits of pavement here and there around the bigger cities, but all roads were gravel at best. And the other thing about your highways, there were some curves on them. They were 90-degree angles there, correction line. You'd have the 90-degree corner that you'd have to slow all the way down and turn. You had the big engine. In North Dakota, of course, the late 1800s was the rapid growth of North Dakota with the railroads coming in, and the railroads brought in lots of people to homestead, free land, and small farm, of course, starting with the quarter section, and you could add to this. But for North Dakota, this really was never enough to prosper as a farm. So even from the beginning, the farm economy was never good. A lot of the farmer struggles, and most farmers were pretty much as they could self-sufficient, but still had to sell something at the end of the harvest to pay loans and supplies. And then in 1929, things went from bad to worse for the farmers. And the boys who were born around World War I were just entering their teens when the Depression hit. Kids would go to a country school, get an 8th grade education, unless they were held out of school to help out on the farm. Most of North Dakota was rural at the time. I mean, most people were living on the small farms. The farmer had to, if the family had enough money, or someone showed promise, they could go to high school, but most ended at the 8th grade, and the rest, we didn't go to high school, went to work, and some of them to support the family. Young men found they could get $1 a week to join the National Guard. Interviewed veterans said they joined for the money. Money was tight. They spent 2 weeks of the year at Camp Grafton near Devil's Lake, which they called a glorified scout outing, where there was a shortage of equipment, weapons, and leadership. And eventually they did end up with some World War I surplus things to fool around with, but not a lot of professional training at that point. And our country went into a shell after World War I. which to us was a war to end all wars. And our military spending was drastically reduced, and the feeling in our country was very anti-war and to stay out of other people's problems. Back to Japan, okay. The army was taking over the government. Radical groups are taking over the army. Japan here is Japan is an island here with very few natural resources. They were getting most of the resources they needed by trade, and they were getting pretty much most of their oil and iron and steel were coming in trade with the United States. So Japan had to be careful how the Japanese were perceived by the United States. The U.S. had forces in the Philippines. I guess they weren't exactly a colony, but we had our forces there to defend the Filipinos. And we were also supplying China with military aid at this time. And as I mentioned, emperor worship became the new religion in Japan. The emperor was considered a living god. And he was allowed to govern as he pleased. If he decided somebody should die, that was it. If he decided somebody should take their own life, you did. You're the military. Harry Carey, I believe, is one we called that. And the other thing that happened now was the samurai sword was back. Not the samurai, that the whole samurai idea was now back in vogue. An officer must lead any attack with his sword, and if he died, which happened a lot because he was out in front, his corpse must face the enemy. In 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria. Not really a colony, they just occupied it. And it's still part of China. In July 1937, Japan was building up its army with the plan of moving north against Russia, Siberia, which is Asia. They were eyeballing first the Pacific coastal areas of Siberia. They already had forces in Russia because Russia was at the time building the Trans-Siberian Railroad and Japan was trying to stop it. So we were already in Russia with our military. And the Army Command was given orders to leave the Chinese alone in Manchuria. And then an incident happened where two Japanese forces and Chinese forces were crossing a bridge, and they were going in opposite directions. They didn't like each other, but gunfire broke out between the two, and this was the start of something big here. They, of course, this is something they weren't supposed to do, but in Manchuria, the Japanese have only junior officers. All the superior officers were back in Japan, and what the junior officers and the military decided to do was take Manchuria by force, which they did very easily. And then we decided to move south into China. They took Beijing, which was now the capital, at the time that wasn't, and then moved down to the new capital, Nanking. And instead of treating people with respect or anything like that, they were brutal. And what happened at Nanking, about 100,000 Chinese soldiers surrendered, and the Japanese butchered them. And from there, they went into the capital, Nanking, and killed, raped, tortured civilians. And they figured maybe as many as 100,000 of them. And this became known as the rape of Nanking around the world. Everybody in the world knew this, and except the people in Japan, because the army now controlled the government and they controlled the presses. So they were hearing about the great victories that the Japanese were. So now the whole image of the Japanese soldier was up complete 180-degree flip. And could the emperor have done anything about this? I mean, there's thinking that maybe he could, but the army was over here on the mainland. They're out of control. The senior officers are over here in Japan, and plus this army was getting results. They were moving fast, and they were making progress. So Japan, Japanese people, everybody was all fired up about their great victories. And once they got Nanking, the army figured, hey, we've got China now. And they said, they were told that in a month we'll have all of China, which of course didn't happen, because Chiang Kai-shek's army kept retreating back there to a new capital, and back here on the Navy ships of Japan could get this far inland that they could not get back here. So it was the Navy now was of no help. And by the way, the Navy and the Army of Japan were never on the same page very much. The Army was controlling the Japanese, or the Navy was sometimes left out of the loop, and it wasn't always well coordinated, but of course that happened in the U.S. also. The different branches and militaries. Okay, back in the U.S. of A. San Bernardino was a town border of Hillsborough, North Dakota. Okay? And he was also an officer in the 164th National Guard, and had eventually worked his way up to Lieutenant Colonel and the regimental executive officer. He kept very thorough and complete diary throughout his service, which was tremendously useful in the military record. And I have here copies of his diary, throughout the war, meticulous notes day by day, and who died, for instance, members of the 164th. And we are all indebted to this, because it had gotten to the point where the 164th was pretty much forgotten by history. And I think it pretty much started where Sam's family asked, what did you do in the war? And they were very amazed what he did in the war. So all of this stuff came to light. Sam put things down in writing, a book, and these things are kept by the Trail County Museum in Hillsboro. And they roster everybody who was in the 164th. And also for the official military record, his notes at the end of his service, they kept them around and used his notes to keep track of the official military records. So I probably wouldn't even be up here talking about it if it wasn't for Sam, because I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have known. One member of the 164th was Carl Vettel, who grew up in a farm near Caledonia, which is by the Red River, north and east of Hillsboro, on a farm, oldest of 12 kids. And he joined the National Guard at the age of 18 in 1937 as a private. He made staff sergeant before they were mobilized, and he became a stateside hero. He was, I guess, in the state of Washington at the time. He was transferred to the West Coast. He was eating lunch and in a restaurant, he heard some shooting going on next door. And so he went next door to investigate, and a couple of bad guys, they were felons, decided to do an armed robbery at the place. So they were shooting out the lights, literally, and one had a shotgun. But anyway, he came up behind the one guy, dragged him outside, and took his gun away, which they didn't say, but I'm sure it was a shotgun. And it went off as they were asking for it. And then he took the shotgun and actually chucked the guy to death. And he ended up with shotgun holes in his clothing afterwards. But he ended up being the stateside hero because he had taken out one guy who had been a problem for the area. So at the same time, though, his comments were basically, didn't know the guy. It was nothing personal. But I don't regret doing it either, you know. But and then he also said, but anybody could have done, anybody would have done, is the way he put it. So, I mean, that was pretty much his attitude. We have Rudy Edmondson from the farm near Brantford, North Dakota. And at the age of 10, his dad pretty much farmed him out as a laborer, and his wages went to his dad. His mom had an expense sort of operation. His dad had to mortgage the farm to pay for it. And in spite of all efforts, they lost the farm anyway. Again, this was depression. This was typical of what was going on back then. And then in 1939, Rudy joined the National Guard to get away from home. Bill Tucker and Kenneth Forbert were town kids from Grand Forks. They went to Central High School, played sports together, and took jobs wherever they could find them. They were a couple others here. Earl Snyder, Dakota TV and Appliance. This is his Guadalcanal patch. He, along with 164th, started out in Guadalcanal and went all the way through World War II to the occupation of Japan. And the rifle was donated by Jim Corcoran. And for Speedway guys here, Jim Corcoran ran the Grand Forks Speedway for 4 years, but he was also a member of the 164th. And then guys from the Indian School in Mapatami also joined the National Guard 164th. And they're always considered good soldiers, but they stayed privates with little chance of promotion. But there was one really big exception to that, and that was Woody Keeble, who became the most decorated soldier in the history of North Dakota. And he probably and did deserve more medals that he got. But Woody, by the time they got finished at Guadalcanal, had been promoted to sergeant, which was for the military pretty easy decision. Okay, so Doug Campbell joined the 164th to be part of the band. Gerald Wright was the band instructor at Lisbon, North Dakota, and he was also a recruiter for the 164th, for the National Guard recruiter, and he was very interested in putting the best band he could put together. He put together an excellent band that played in many places and many events throughout North Dakota. The U.S. regulations allow 28 band members for the regiments. And for a while, he had over 50. And the sales pitch was that band members would never have to serve on the front lines as medics and litter bearers, like during World War I. That's what they did with the band members. He said, because so many of our top troops had been killed in World War I, Congress had made sure it would never happen again. So the band members were wondering why in training that they were taught first aid and reminded over and over again that your first aid may be their last aid. This is the veterans you rent for fond recollection of that. This is the 164th band, trimmed down to 28 because now they were active. In 1939, the U.S. Army only had about 190,000 men. That's the size of our army. And members of the 164th at this point were beginning to wonder if they were going to end up in war. And while there was fighting going on in Europe, the 164th was also wondering if they went to war, whose side would they be on? I mean, it wasn't determined at that point. But in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and this was the beginning of beginning of World War II in Europe. And England had a pact with Poland that they would defend them if invaded, so England was now on the war. And the U.S. had been already supplying England, and so the 164th believed then that if they ever went to war, they would be fighting against the Germans. In 1940, the 164th was sent to Fort Ripley in Minnesota for 3 weeks of serious training. In May 1940, Germany attacked France, and President Roosevelt declared an unlimited national emergency and a peacetime draft. In December of 1940, the 164th was mobilized and sent to Louisiana for training. And the 164th was sworn in on February 10th, 1941. The draft then would bring in 1 million men, and the Guard units another 250,000, rebuilding the military for the U.S. And the Navy and the Air Corps were also enlarged. And the 164th became the 164th Regiment as part of the 34th Infantry Division, and many more members were added, not from North Dakota, from the area, to enlarge it. With most of the European colonies, the colonials in Europe, now occupied by Japan, saw an opportunity here. It's September 22, 1940, Japan's troops crossed the border. Oh, that was the wrong button, yeah. Crossed the border into Indochina. And I got you this, put this, I know. I have trouble with altering those. Can't even work my TV anymore. They crossed the border into Indochina, which we now know, of course, is Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Cambodia. And with this invasion, the United States announced no more steel would be sent to Japan, and we were their largest supplier. On September 25th, December 27th, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed a peace pact. The Axis powers became the Axis powers. On July 18, 1941, the United States cut off its petroleum supply for Japan. There was none on the island, so they're getting most of the petroleum from here. They were getting a little bit from the Dutch East Indies down here, but there were natural oil reserves out here. So on September 6th, General Tojo, by the way, who had pretty much taken over now as the Prime Minister, and the Emperor had to appoint him because nobody else would do it, because, as they said, for their health, their life expense was very, very short. So Tojo was appointed Prime Minister, giving him 100% control then of the government and the newspapers. He had control of Japan. And the other thing was, I guess, the Navy was not part of this, it was the Army. So it will matter later. Anyway, he was given complete power by the Emperor. The army and the emperor's consultants, because the emperor only could find out what was going on up from his consultants, and they were having a hard time even finding out what was going on over here on the continents. Anyway, they decided that because of the oil being cut off, that they needed to move quickly, so they moved down here and took the Indochina or the Dutch East Indies, giving them a source of oil and of course some other valuable minerals that they would need, and then moved westward, then took the north part of Guinea and took the Solomon Islands. All this time they were in danger of drawing the U.S. into the war. The admiral of the Navy, his name is Yamamoto, who had been left out of everything, but he was head of the Navy, and the Army decided that a surprise attack on the U.S. naval fleet was necessary. And when informed of this, Yamamoto said these idiots in the Army were making war with the U.S. inevitable. War planners figured it would take the U.S. 4 years to get ready for war, and since they seemed not interested anyway in war, that an attack on our military would probably make the United States sue for peace, but they wouldn't be interested in war anyway. That's the Army. They planned to destroy the naval base in Hawaii, making it easy for the Army then to conquer Hawaii. And after knocking out Hawaii, they were supposed to head over to Midway and then take Midway. Okay, Hawaii and Midway is up here. Yeah. The military working, the Navy then was sent to Hawaii, and the first total surprise, complete surprise, the first airstrike took out the big battleships and at Pearl Harbor, and the second airstrikes was met with a little more resistance, anti-aircraft fire and things like that. They did lose some planes, but the admiral in charge of this attack on Hawaii was Admiral Naguma, who Yamamoto really didn't like very much and considered him kind of way too careful. But after the first two strikes, they then were supposed to take out the oil tanks, the repair facilities, the arsenals, and that would leave Pearl Harbor as functioning harbor. That's what he was supposed to do. And then on the way back, he was supposed to head over to Midway and take out Midway. And he didn't do any of that. He cut short after two strikes at Hawaii and headed back. And Japan and the Army were celebrating this great victory, and Yamamoto was angry at the failure of Yamamoto. So the U.S. declared war on Japan. And Japan immediately, like I said, moved to conquer the East Indies so they'd have a supply of oil. And also, the Philippines, the New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Thailand, and Burma. Where's Burma? Over here. Which the idea now is they're surrounding China. And since we were supplying China now, the only supply route was through Burma and what was called the Burma Road. So Japan had put, I guess we have a dotted line here. Japan had put together the largest Earth's surface empire ever in the world. Mostly all watered, and they had done it in 4 months, which surprised even them. They had a timeline on how they were going to proceed here. On December 7th, of course, Japan declared war on the U.S. and Germany and Italy soon followed. In December 8, 1941, the 64th Regiment would be detached from the 34th Division and was headed for San Francisco. I'm going to forward to this one. We've not. This was typical in the United States of our perception of the Japanese. The material conservation, this would have been conserved resources here in the United States because we were racist, and considering the way Japanese were treating the people that they conquered, this was pretty much the image that we were showing in the United States of the Japanese. And part of our efforts to consolidate the people and to sell war bonds. Anyway, General Marshall, who was in charge of the entire military, had been aware of the possibility of war with Japan. And he had decided ahead of time to train the National Guard troops for the Japanese war. The National Guard troops didn't know this. And now knew they weren't going to Europe. Also, when they were thrown in February, they were told it was for 1 year. One year deployment. They knew that it was going to be, by now they knew it was going to be stretched out. It wasn't going to be more than 1 year. The band members were informed they would be medics and stretcher bearers, and some were transferred to rifle companies. As Doug Carpenter recalled, those fellows are mad as hell, and I don't blame them. Says the 164th was first assigned to protect the Pacific from a Japanese attack, and 164th, they left California by ship on March 18th, okay, and the ship cramped, very uncomfortable, and they arrived in Australia on April 7th. 4 days later, the ship headed back to New Caledonia. Now here. New Caledonia, which is kind of ironical because Carl Vetter was from Caledonia, North Dakota, so now he's in New Caledonia. In New Caledonia, they did have some time to spare besides the training. They would gamble. And this is also, of course, coming across the ocean. You'd gamble until your money was gone, They played cards, told stories, and read anything they could get their hands on, magazines, newspapers, comic books, and something new. 1939, the United States came out with the 4 by 11 paperback, and they were cheap. During the Depression, it started in the mid-30s in England, but spread like wildfire. You could buy these for the pack of cigarettes, or instead of $10 for a hardcover book, these could be sometimes bought for $1 or in that range. So very popular with the GIs. It's part of their package that went along with cigarettes and shading and New Testament Bible. Again, very popular. The other thing about the paperbacks is they are now out of print, starting now. They're just not selling anymore, so they're going out of print. So you won't be able to buy new ones anymore. So these will end up being part of the museum.
Music.
The Japanese war planners had completed what they called phase 1, which I had just talked about here, and now we're planning phase 2. And what they decided is that they were going to spread out. No, they decided they were too far spread out. Okay. To finish off China and Russia, that had been a target early, for more than a decade. Hitler had, of course, invaded Russia at this time, and he was bogging down, and so Japan decided invading Russia right now would be a really bad idea, and so they crossed Russia off their list. Also, part of the decision, the Axis powers decided to leave Russia alone and to leave Russia neutral in this whole war thing, Axis against the Allies. So Japan had decided on easy targets for phase 2. The Philippines, nods you. Got to keep your finger out that long. Well, okay, they decided on Philippines, New Caledonia now up here, where, of course, the 164th and all the other National Guards were. Out here in Fiji, Samoa, British New Guinea, the northern half of the island. No, British New Zealand was the south part of the island. The Aleutian Islands, which is part of Alaska. The reason they were looking at that because they were concerned about the U.S. having airfields up there that they could easily hit Japan with. And Midway Islands. These were going to be the next easy targets. The Japanese first lured the Americans into a battle in the Coral Sea down here. They were, planning on moving south, so battle in Coral Sea, Navy, both sides declared victory, both sides took heavy losses, but the Japanese with the superior Navy still at this point were still controlled the waters. Aleutians are easy. Nobody was there. There were no airfields, nothing. And once they got up there, took a couple of the islands, we didn't even know they were there. And even when we did find out, it's like we didn't dare very much. But anyway, they took a couple islands up here of the United States. The next target was Fort Mosby down here. Point Mosby on New Guinea. And they had the transports loaded. Port Mosby was defended by the Australians. The English had no opportunity to, so they were probably how the Australians. But anyway, the Japanese had their transports loaded and ready to head for Point Mosby when Yamamoto pulled them, several of the Navy vessels away to attack Midway. And so they decided they had better wait until the Navy came back after conquering Midway. And the Yamamoto's plan after Midway, he was going to go finish the job at Hawaii that, as he said, it was never finished. He was going to finish it. So Yamamoto headed for Midway with 8 carriers and 11 battleships as part of the fleet, and secret attacked. And the stories of Midway was we cleverly cracked the code and we knew he was headed for Midway, so we prepared as best we could. Still outnumbered, but the fighting followed the fleet, sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and heavy cruisers and other ships damaged. And the other thing that Japan lost that was irreplaceable were over 300 experienced pilots. For some reason, Japan was not training new pilots. I don't know, they just weren't. Their veteran pilots have been there for a long time, so okay. I guess I'm taking longer than I thought. Guadalcanal. Little strip here. You did, yeah. Little red strip here was the Emerson Field. The Guadalcanal, 90 miles wide, 25 miles across, and August 7th, 20,000 Marines landed, and at the island north here, killed all the Japanese infantry, went across to the airfield where there was nobody to defend it, and took it easily, and then they had to defend it for a long time. The Marines were right down, so the 164th was chosen. 164th National Guard was chosen to be sent. The Navy and the Air Force of Japan had complete control of the area, and that meant total resupply and everything. And the Marines were sent on what was possibly a suicide mission, that the potential of being totally wiped out was real. And the same thing with the 164th, sent to be reinforced. That there's chances are they would be totally annihilated. The Navy felt they could not reinforce, so. This is Henderson Field during the rainy season. It was bad. Heavy rains, mosquitoes, scorpions, giant biting centipedes, crocodiles, and on the first day there, they arrived October 13th. On the first day there, it was a daily thing, the bombings tended. Forbert was killed in an air raid. Ken Forbert from Grand Forks, so he was the first fatality of the war. There was Navy shelling, and I was gonna take a look at this from the Gray's point of view. The Japanese Navy bombarded the troops with such ferocity that even war-hardened Marines had a tough time with. The two Japanese battleships surrounding Hendersonville, nearly 1,000 14-inch shells tearing two airships and knocking out just about our whole military airplanes, all of them. And the actual battle that followed for the field, the 164th is stationed down here in the quiet zone. There was patrols that found nothing out in the woods, or jungles, and they figured the attack would come from over here, which several already had. So the Marines, this whole perimeter here, Marines here, and 164th here, and the third of the 3rd Battalion was kept in reserve, and I'm going to, I think they'll summarize. Anyway, what the Japanese did was they brought 6,000 guys through the jungle down around here. They gave them 4 days rations, and you had to carry everything because they're going through swamps, up and down cliffs, across raging rivers with muddy, high the slopes, bridges. Anyway, 6 days or 4 days ration. It took them 6 days to get there. So by the time they got there, they were starving, they were wore out, but they were in high spirits. They sung the national anthem and shouted death to the blood for the emperor was what they were chanting. And from there, it started the invasion. They would send groups in charging, led by a officer with his sword, leading the way, and they were told that the U.S. were violent, haughty, cowardly, and didn't like fighting in the dark and in the rain. But anyway, 6,000 Japanese troops ended up out here opposite the 164th that was placed here to gain some experience. And the 3rd Regiment then had to be brought in to reinforce this area. Bloody fighting, and went on for a couple days, and hordes of Japanese came charging bayonet charges at the American troops, and they just kept sending waves of them until they basically ran out of Japanese. The 164th suffered 35 dead and 50 wounded in this battle. In front of the 164th down here, there were between 1,005 and 1,500 to 2,000 dead and Japanese. From this, the Marines very impressed. They came to call the 164th as the 164th Marines, fought with them side by side the rest of the way through Guadalcanal, and what turned out to be a real blood battle. Carl Vettel was killed. Was killed, you know, in this area. They were sending in more troops, and now our Navy and Air Force were taking control of things. Japanese Navy had backed off. The transfer of the Japanese forces coming in to Coley Point there was intercepted, and one estimate was that the Japanese lost 24,000 troops at sea before they could even get to. But these are the same troops that were gonna invade New Caledonia and further south. So, I mean, that plan completely fell apart. But the bottom line was this was the end of the advancement of the Japanese in the war, and from this point on, they were on the defensive through the whole war. And the taking the rest of Guadalcanal took 120 days. The 164th hauled it, 120 days of hell. The Marines could add on 2.5 months onto that, but it was desperate, blindly fighting. The Japanese in these ridges here were dug in, pretty much impossible to get out of there. You know, shelling and stuff. But what happened was the Japanese were retreating, and instead of landing more troops, they were taking them off the island and left guys behind on these ridges, unsupplied with ammunition or food to fight to the death. And so that's what they did. Some starved to death. But it was bloody fighting. And of course, from there on, we went on to Warheadville, and from there to the Philippines. And at the end of the war, some of the 164th spent as long as a year in Japan occupation. The cemetery at Guadalcanal. So, I'll end it there. The other thing I was going to mention, though, was one thing the guys did for recreation, and everybody played baseball. Back then, baseball was big in North Dakota, so everybody was a baseball player. So when they get the basic training, same size, same shape as a baseball. So everybody wouldn't say familiar with, but they were as comfortable as they could be. And I was going to mention here
Woody?
no, a craft.
Oh, Garth Mills. Yep.
Yeah. think he draft. I took baseball coaching from him and baseball coaching at practice and at practice in the class. If you were ever to fumble a baseball, class stopped. He would inform everybody that he taught hand grenade and strategic training to these young, inexperienced guys. And did you ever fumble a baseball, of course, and the error could cost you a run due to the knee. If you fumble this, oh, you just go. So anyway, 164th were excellent at that. Win Keeble was being recruited by the Chicago White Sox as a pitcher before the war, and he was excellent at the grenade, not only strong arm, but accurate. And that helped him eventually to win the Medal of Honor, which he eventually received. I'm going to end with, I went over, I could go out there another hour easy. Questions, comments? Anybody? Yes?
I read somewhere that the 164th outfought the Marines. Is there any evidence to that?
The Marines considered them equals, which is a heck of a compliment. In that one area that they were defending, the response to that is probably yes. The 164th got a group citation, which more or less means giving a medal to each individual, more or less, who fought there. But there was lots of hand-to-hand content, lots of hand-to-hand fighting going on also. The Japanese had made it, infiltrated the land, and the battle was at night also. So, I mean, maybe in that situation, but not I guess I've never heard. It's possible, but I would not say better than but the Marines said equal to, which is a heck of a compliment coming from William. Anybody else?
Zoe.
Well, that?
Were you like Zoe?
No, I was never in the military.
So